A group of friends was already in the private room waiting for me, but Jake had still not arrived. Just as I was about to call him, Jake walked in with Chloe by his side. They were clearly a perfect match. Everyone laughed and teased them for being late, telling them they each had to drink 3 cups as a punishment. Chloe pouted, pretending she couldn't drink, while Jake laughed heartily, raising his glass to down 3 cups in one go. He then pulled Chloe to the center of the sofa, trapping her on his lap like a playful kitten. Everyone around us stared at them with envy, but their eyes lingered on me with pity. I simply smiled and said, "What are you looking at me for? I'm not the birthday girl." Jake looked up at me and said, "Emily, everyone's here and I need to clear things up. We're both tired of this relationship. Chloe is different from you. I don't want her to be wronged, but you've been with me for 5 years, so I'm not heartless. If you can accept her, you'll live in the villa in the west, and she will live in the east. You won't interfere with each other's lives." I couldn't help but laugh in anger. "So, you want me and Chloe to share a man?" I asked. Jake raised an eyebrow, his gaze sharp like an eagle's. Coldly, he responded, "Then we'll break up." I simply replied, "Fine, break up," before heading to open the door. As I closed it behind me, I overheard his brother telling Jake, "You're going too far. Even your sister-in-law's upset. Go after her." Jake lifted Chloe's chin and kissed her lightly before coldly saying, "Where would she run off to? She probably went home to make me porridge. She loves me so much that she could never leave me." The room erupted in laughter, mocking my devotion to Jake. It seemed in their eyes I was nothing more than a humble servant, willing to do anything for him. I tugged at the corner of my mouth, realizing how worthless I appeared to them. Not wanting to stay another second, I shut the door behind me, leaving the mocking laughter behind. Back at my apartment, I packed up my things, sending them home, and then pulled out the plane ticket I had bought. This was supposed to be a surprise for Jake, a birthday trip to Bali together, but now it had become my solo trip after the breakup. I briefly considered posting about it on social media, but deleted it as soon as I thought better of it. As I settled into my seat on the plane, a tall figure appeared next to me. To my surprise, it was Luke. He had once been a close friend of mine and Jake's college roommate, but after Jake and I got together, Jake forbade me from interacting with other men, and we lost contact. I looked at Luke, stunned, and asked, "What are you doing here?" Luke winked mischievously and replied, "It's fine for you to go abroad to relax, but I can't go on vacation myself." I felt a tightness in my chest. My first thought was that he had seen my deleted post, and I suddenly found myself at a loss for words. Luke must have known I had broken up with Jake. Jake had just announced his relationship with Chloe on social media, their fingers intertwined with smiling faces, showing off how happy he was with his new girlfriend, while I, the old flame, seemed to be of no value. Luke leaned closer, his lips brushing against my ear as he whispered, "It's okay. You don't have to hide anything from me. If you want to cry, just cry." I pouted but didn't want to cry, yet the tears came anyway. Luke sighed softly, wiping my tears with his sleeve and gently patting my shoulder as though comforting a child. "I'm here with you," he said. When the plane landed, my tears had soaked one of Luke's jackets. Holding it awkwardly, I apologized. "I'll wash it and return it to you." Luke smiled faintly and nodded, then followed me into the hotel. I turned to him, confused, and asked, "Are you really here for a vacation? It's such a coincidence that we booked the same hotel. I booked my room 3 months ago." He shrugged and said, "I'm used to not bringing luggage. Experiencing the local culture is the most important thing." I felt a sense of helplessness. However, when I checked in, the front desk told me that Luke hadn't reserved a room. She said the hotel was fully booked. I asked him, "Didn't you tell me you had a room here?" Luke scratched his head and finally admitted, "I saw your post on social media and then deleted it. I was worried you might do something drastic. I came here on a sudden impulse, but I didn't expect there would be no rooms available." My emotions became complicated. Luke has been paying attention to me. He even noticed the post I deleted almost immediately. But at the same time, it made me realize that Jake, who had been with me for 5 years, never seemed to notice my disappointment or my tears. Maybe he just didn't care. The atmosphere became tense, and I sighed, telling Luke, "Why don't you stay in my room? I booked the presidential suite. There's more than enough space." As soon as I stepped into the room and saw the bed covered in rose petals, my face instantly turned red. This was a surprise I'd prepared for Jake. I specifically asked the hotel to make it warm and romantic. But now, with Luke here, it felt completely wrong. And when I thought about how I had impulsively let Luke stay with me, just a man and a woman alone together, it felt awkward. So I decided to message my best friend, Sophia, on WeChat. Knowing she would know about Bali, I quickly typed, I ran into Luke. He couldn't find a room, so now he's sharing mine. Do you think it's too late to regret this? Sophia replied right away, Luke is quite persistent, huh? I was a bit surprised and asked, persistent? She responded, his feelings for you are persistent. I've never heard of him having a girlfriend in 5 years. This left me thinking deeply. I had never really taken Luke's feelings seriously, and his past confessions never truly sank in. Sophia sent a dismissive emoji, adding, Jake treated you like that, and now you still want to chase him? Besides, someone like Luke is rare. How often do you meet someone like him? He'll find someone else, and you should too. I instinctively shook my head, replying, it's different. I don't want to waste Luke's time. Since Jake became distant, my feelings for him have faded, but that doesn't mean I'll just find a man to pass the time. That night, I slept in the bed while Luke stayed on the sofa. During the day, we spent time together. It was a bit awkward at first, but against the beautiful backdrop, we quickly became comfortable. From sunrise to sunset, we had an amazing time. Luke even mentioned some embarrassing moments from my past, and I chased him on the beach, hitting him out of frustration. Luke laughed so hard that he was breathless and eventually just laid on the sand, letting me boss him around. After I got tired of hitting him, I lay next to him, watching the sunset. He leaned close to my ear and said, I haven't heard you laugh like that in a long time. It felt like the darkness in my heart had lifted. I yelled toward the sea, from now on, I want to laugh like this every day. Luke whispered something in my ear, but the wind was so strong that I couldn't catch it. When I asked him what he said, he just shook his head. At that moment, Sophia called, Emily, when are you coming back? I had planned to return the day after tomorrow, but I suddenly didn't want this trip to end. I half-jokingly turned to Luke and asked, so, when do you plan on going back? Luke smiled at me and replied, I'll follow your lead. I was about to tell Sophia that I would stay a few extra days, but before I could, the call ended. Back in the private room, Sophia turned off the speakerphone and looked at Jake. Looks like a sigh of relief, she said. Did you hear that Emily is having so much fun surrounded by beautiful scenery and handsome guys? I bet she's waking up smiling now. Stop imagining how sad she would be to leave. Jake's face immediately darkened. Her travel buddy is a guy? Sophia sneered. What does that have to do with you? Jake narrowed his eyes dangerously and his anger flared. Before he could say more, Sophia was pulled out of the booth by her boyfriend, Chris. The tension in the room grew thick. Mutual friends tried to ease the mood, saying, Don't listen to Sophia's nonsense. You know Emily loves you. You understand in your heart she wouldn't like anyone else. Another suggested, Why don't you call your sister-in-law and reassure her? Jake paused for a moment, and someone around him picked up his phone to dial my number. A mechanical voice on the speaker responded, The number you dialed is not in service. Someone in the room whispered, She must have blocked Jake's number. Furious, Jake slammed the glass in his hand onto the floor, yelling, From now on, just consider Emily dead. Don't mention her again. Anyone who does, I won't let it go. After that, he left the club without looking back. Driving back to his apartment, he sat there, staring at the empty house, lost in thought. Emily's face flashed in his mind. This time, she didn't come back to ask for a reconciliation, which was something he hadn't expected. Suddenly, a gust of wind blew open the balcony door. Jake frowned and stood up to close it, only to spot a plane ticket on the floor. He picked it up and saw his name clearly printed on it, with Bali as the destination. The timing was perfect. It was the day after his birthday. He realized that the trip to Bali had been a birthday surprise Emily had planned for him. Memories from the past surged through him. During their 2 years of the happiest time together, Emily had once mentioned in a sweet moment that she wanted to go to Bali. At the time, Jake had been too busy, but he thought to himself that someday he would make Bali the place where he proposed to her. Jake tightly held onto the plane ticket, his eyes filled with deep contemplation. After Luke and I finished our itinerary, We returned to the capital in the afternoon of the second day. I wanted to thank him for his company, so I suggested we go for a meal at my place. I had once spent 6 months learning to cook just to please Jake's tastes, and now, looking back, it seemed like the only skill I had gained from that relationship. We went to the supermarket together to buy ingredients and then headed back to my house. Everything was set. As I entered the kitchen to serve the third dish, the lights suddenly went out. I called out, "Luke!" Immediately, a beam of light flashed toward me as Luke turned on the flashlight on his phone and calmly walked over. "It might be an electrical issue," he said. "Do you have a toolbox?" I remembered that the toolbox was in the TV cabinet. I turned on the light and walked over to the cabinet, finding the toolbox inside. Luke asked me to shine the flashlight on him as he planned to fix the circuit. I stood by him as he worked when suddenly he shouted, "Give me your hand!" I frowned slightly and asked, "My hand?" Luke raised his voice, "Yes, your hand." I hesitated, but he reached out, and I slowly placed my hand in his. The air became thick with tension. Luke glanced at me, and even in the dim light, I could see his ears turning red. He stammered, "I said, the hand." I was taken aback and didn't know how to react. Luke added softly, "That's not impossible either," and then took my hand, picking up the wrench from the toolbox. It was only then that I realized he had meant for me to take the wrench. I quickly pulled my hand back and my face flushed with heat. I cleared my throat to break the silence. I thought to myself that I must have misheard, but Luke smiled and his deep voice sounded even more enchanting in the darkness, almost like it had some sort of magic. My heart raced unusually fast in that moment. Luke gently asked, "Do you remember the love letter I once wrote to you back in college?" Luke had anonymously written me a love letter, and I recognized his handwriting immediately. At that time, I was only focused on Jake, so I carelessly threw the love letter into the trash. One day, when Luke came over to my place, he accidentally saw the discarded letter. I still remember his expression of shock. He stood still for a few seconds before he smiled and said, "Emily, I forgot to mention, this is from Jake. He asked me to give it to you." He must have panicked, making up an awkward lie, thinking he could fool me. I pretended to be angry, lightly hitting him a few times and complaining about why he hadn't told me earlier. Then I picked up the love letter and put it back in the drawer. After that, we both silently agreed to never bring it up again. Looking back now, I feel a faint ache in my heart. The pain of unrequited love. The version of me 5 years ago couldn't understand this feeling, but now, abandoned by Jake, I truly do. I looked at Luke's profile and softly said, "I'm sorry, Luke." Luke stared intently at me, his eyes looking especially deep under the light, almost as if they contained stars within them. "Emily, I like you. I know you're not ready yet, but I need to tell you how I feel. After you got together with Jake, I've regretted not telling you sooner. I always wonder, what if I had told you back then?" At that moment, there was a sudden knock on the door, causing Luke to stop speaking. He lowered his head and quickly turned the knob, and the lights instantly brightened, creating a strange shift in the atmosphere. I got up to open the door, and I was shocked to see a familiar figure standing there. It was Jake. For a second, I almost thought I was dreaming. Jake looked at me with a hint of mockery and impatience. "Emily, are you playing this game of push and pull to force me into a corner? Now that I've broken up with Chloe, are you satisfied?" Jake breaking up with Chloe was just a way for me to express my anger. I tried to calm myself and said, "Jake, you're the one who initiated the breakup. I don't owe you anything. I hope our past lives no longer intersect." As soon as I finished speaking, Jake slammed his fist against my door and his angry voice rang out. "Emily, what do you want from me? I've already broken up with her." Just then, a deep voice came from behind me. It was Luke. He said coldly, "Emily doesn't want to have anything to do with you anymore, Jake. Can't you understand simple language?" Jake's expression changed as he pointed at Luke and asked, "Why is he here with you?" I replied lightly, "This is none of your business." Jake seemed to suddenly realize something, frowning. "Is Luke going with you to Bali?" Luke quickly explained, "Emily and I are just travel companions." Jake snorted dismissively, seemingly saying, "What do you think will happen when a man and a woman are alone together? Should I treat you like a 3-year-old? Emily, I thought you were better than that." His words cut through me like a knife, making each breath feel suffocating. Luke, in his anger, swung his fist at Jake. Jake's face turned, and I quickly grabbed Luke's hand. Luke stared at me for a long time, and after seeing me shake my head, he quickly shut the door. Suddenly, Jake's voice came from outside. Emily, I'll give you one more chance. Just admit your mistake, and I can still forgive you. This is the last time. Next time, I won't be so soft-hearted. Emily's heart sank completely. Jake's hand lingered on the door for a moment, hesitating, but in the end, he let it drop. He started regretting what he just said. He realized how well-behaved Emily was and that she would never betray him. But the closer people are, the easier it is to hurt each other. He admitted to himself that he was filled with jealousy, jealous of the time Luke had spent with Emily, jealous of the memories they shared that Jake couldn't be a part of. Back in college, Luke had been his equal in both academics and looks, and Jake had always wanted to compete with him. But when Emily came into the picture, Jake noticed that Luke's eyes always followed her. As a man, Jake immediately realized that Luke had feelings for her, and his competitive spirit pushed him to pursue Emily as well. During that time, Jake spared no expense in his pursuit of Emily. He bought everything that women liked: flowers, luxury cars, jewelry, spending lavishly. Rumors spread around school about how Jake, the heartthrob, had spent $3 million to chase after the school's beauty. Even the teachers teased him, saying that if he had applied the same energy into his studies, he could have already earned a spot to study abroad. Jake simply smiled, thinking to himself that he didn't want to compete for fear of losing her to someone else. As he reflected on this, he glanced at Luke and noticed the light in his eyes dimming. In that moment, Jake found it strangely interesting. As time went on, Jake became more serious. He started recalling every smile from Emily, waiting foolishly for her to reach out to him. When she finally agreed to be his girlfriend, Jake felt as though he had won the world. Memories of the past flooded back, and he drank a few shots at the bar, feeling the pain in his stomach and thinking about the porridge Emily used to make for him. He knew she would wake up at 5 in the morning to make it for his digestion. At first, he felt guilty for her effort, but over time, he grew accustomed to it, thinking it was just expected. Eventually, he even found the porridge too rich. It turned out she hadn't changed, only he had. Jake, nearly drunk, asked the bartender to call him a ride. The driver asked where he lived, and Jake, in his groggy state, gave Emily's apartment address. Only with her could he call it home. After closing the door, I lowered my head like a child who had done something wrong. Luke gently ruffled my hair and said, "Emily, I've been waiting for you for 5 years. Waiting a few more years won't be a burden for me." Later that night, I had a dream. In it, Luke's eyes were filled with thick fog, full of sadness and self-mockery. It was cold, and Jake draped a coat over me, while Luke also took out a piece of clothing from his backpack. He smiled at Jake, then looked at me, but the gesture of handing me the clothing paused in midair. While we were playing a game, Luke reached for my hand, but I quickly grabbed Jake's hand instead and hid in his embrace. A series of images flashed through my dream. When I woke up, I realized those weren't dreams, but moments I had overlooked. My eyes became moist. Suddenly, I heard a knock on the door. I quietly got out of bed and opened the door to find Jake leaning unsteadily against it. Seeing the tear stains on my face, he asked with concern, "Did you cry?" I was about to yell at him, completely baffled by his behavior, but when he moved closer, I could smell the strong scent of alcohol. It turned out Jake was drunk. I instinctively wanted to scold him, especially since he had just recovered from gastritis, but I realized I no longer had the right to blame him. Hearing the first part of my sentence, Jake suddenly had red eyes and knelt down, pleading, "Go ahead, scold me, I deserve it. I was wrong. Please give me another chance." Not wanting to disturb the neighbors so late, I reluctantly opened the door and said, "Come in first, then we'll talk." Only then did Jake stumble inside. Unlike his usual self, drunk Jake seemed particularly calm and quiet. He started rambling about the moments we had shared, and I quietly listened, though my heart remained completely unmoved. Soon after, Jake fell asleep. When I woke up the next day, he was already sitting on the sofa. As I walked by him, he softly said, "My stomach hurts. Can you make me some stomach-soothing porridge like before?" I glanced at him and replied, "How about I order you some takeout?" In the past, I would have been the one ready with ingredients to make porridge at any time. But now, that wasn't needed. Jake lowered his head and fell silent for a while before finally saying, "No need." There was an indescribable weight in the air. I hurriedly finished getting ready, opened the door to let Jake out, and found Kay standing there, a hint of expectation on her face. "Aren't you going to see me off?" she asked. I had no choice but to follow Jake through the corridor, but then he suddenly stopped and softly said, "Emily, can you hug me?" I refused, replying, "Jake, we've already broken up." He choked up, seeming on the verge of tears. The next day, Sophia approached me. We had co-founded a jewelry brand called IMU, but due to our lack of experience, we had no marketing strategy and didn't know how to promote it, which led to it never taking off. Sophia suggested, "Why not consult Luke? He's now a leading figure in finance magazines. You can't miss such a valuable resource. Are you being fair to me as your partner?" she added. Recently, it seemed that Luke and I had developed a subtle, exploratory relationship. He moved forward, and I pulled back, he advanced, and I defended myself. But when it came to work, I felt it was beyond my control. Sophia waved her hand in front of me, interrupting my thoughts. "The opportunity is slipping away. You need to hurry up and schedule with Luke." After finishing her words, she pushed me forward, so I had no choice but to arrange an appointment with Luke's company as the founder of Adore Accessories. However, when I arrived, I found out the appointments were booked until next month. With no other option, I decided to go directly to Luke's company. The receptionist impatiently informed me that the schedule was indeed full, so I stammered, "Then just tell him Emily is looking for him." The receptionist gave me a suspicious look, but a few seconds later, a man claiming to be Luke's assistant appeared and took me to see him. Luke looked a bit surprised. "Why did you come to the office to find me?" I felt a bit embarrassed, but quickly explained my purpose. Luke listened attentively, analyzing our situation one by one. In that moment, I finally understood that the biggest challenge for our brand was unclear positioning. He carefully examined the series of designs we had launched and asked, "What kind of spirit does Amer want to convey?" This question left me speechless. Initially, I had designed accessories purely out of passion, never considering what kind of support a brand needed. Many of my design inspirations came from little moments in my relationship with Jake, which is why they had a youthful, romantic vibe. As my feelings for him faded, the later designs started to reflect a completely different style. I discussed this with Sophia for a long time, and Luke also joined the conversation. He mentioned that by the seaside in Bali, I once said I wanted to laugh out loud. And that spirit aligned well with the values of modern, independent women. As soon as Sophia heard this, she immediately agreed, and everyone unanimously decided to position Amer as a brand showcasing the beauty of independent women who no longer relied on men, focusing on the concept of self-growth. Therefore, I created many sketches based on this theme and developed a self-appreciation jewelry series. Luke stayed up late with me to find inspiration and even used his resources to promote the self-appreciation series for free, leveraging his connections in the entertainment industry to help promote IMU. As a result, IMU quickly gained popularity. We opened our first counter at Eden Mall, and Luke invited the popular actress Anna to be the guest of honor at the ribbon-cutting ceremony. The event was bustling with excitement. At the ribbon-cutting ceremony, I stood in the front row while Luke smiled from the corner, showcasing the self-appreciation jewelry series. When I glanced at him, an inexplicable flutter surged in my chest. Sophia, noticing the moment, nudged my shoulder teasingly and said, "My dear, it's really unreasonable for you not to accept Luke any longer. These past few days, Luke has almost turned our studio into a second home, and I can always see him around." Seeing me stay silent, Sophia put her arm around my shoulder and continued, "Look at him. He's handsome, wealthy, and so devoted. How can anyone not be moved? Other women are fighting for his attention." I followed her gaze and saw Anna chatting happily with Luke, their laughter filling the air. A wave of bitterness surged in my chest. I made an excuse to slip into the break room, telling myself to stay calm, but when I turned around, I found Luke right behind me. "What are you doing here?" I was startled. He looked at me with concern, his tone gentle. "I noticed you seemed a bit off earlier, so I followed you." I started to wonder if Luke was an expert in reading micro-expressions. How could he detect my every move so quickly? I explained, "I'm fine. I've just been feeling a bit tired lately." After a while, I casually mentioned Anna, thanking him for inviting her. "To invite such a big star, you must have a deep friendship, right?" After I asked, I couldn't help but blush. Luke smiled slightly. The whole world knows I'm pursuing you, including Anna. Gradually, the anxiety in my heart faded, replaced by a sense of security. Luke understood what I cared about, and he was taking the initiative to clarify his relationship with other women. Then he looked at me tenderly and said, "Once I set my sights on someone, I stick with them. No one else catches my eye except for you. So, Emily, can you trust me just this once?" His words were sincere, and in that small space, I suddenly heard the sound of my own heartbeat thumping loudly. It made me want to cry a little. What I truly desired was that simple. I gently hugged him, but I wasn't willing to let him lead me around. After sniffing a bit, I said, "All right, I'll trust you. I'll trust you this once, but there has to be a trial period," I said. Luke chuckled softly, his chest lightly vibrating. "As long as it's not a 7-day, no questions asked return policy." I couldn't help but smile at him. Then, standing on my tiptoes, I covered his eyes with my hands and kissed him on the lips. Unexpectedly, Luke placed his hand over my ears and gently nibbled on my lips, like he was savoring every moment, kissing me for an extended time. I became so shy that I started backing away, and only after I begged several times did he finally let me go. As Luke and I stepped out of the room, Sophia winked at me teasingly. I felt a little embarrassed, so I quickly sent Luke back to his office. Just then, a familiar figure appeared in the crowd. Chris had come with a group of friends to show support. He walked over to Sophia, smiling widely, and exchanged a few words with her. Then, mysteriously, he handed me a bag. Seeing my puzzled expression, Chris scratched his head and said, "Jake asked me to give this to you." I almost refused, but Chris insisted. "It's the grand opening today. Everything should start with a good omen. Why spoil the mood?" Reluctantly, I placed the bag in the cabinet for now. Since the brand had gone viral on social media and with the presence of the stars, customers kept flowing in. While reviewing the accounts, I was surprised to see that the day's sales exceeded my expectations. The sales assistant, Shaya, excitedly showed us a pre-order list. One customer had placed orders for the brand's jewelry for the next 6 months. Such a large order was truly unexpected. Sophia and I exchanged glances, and I took the pre-order form. The customer's name was clearly written on it, Jake. I couldn't help but sigh. "What does he really want?" I muttered. Sophia sneered. "He regrets it, huh? Serves him right. If he had been sincere from the start, maybe things would have been different." Thinking about the bag Chris had handed me earlier, I immediately went to retrieve it from the cabinet. When I opened it, I found the Williams family heirloom jade bracelet inside. I remembered that when Jake and I were dating, he had once told me that this bracelet was passed down through the wives of the Williams family and that someday it would be placed on my wrist, making me his rightful wife. At that time, I dreamt of wearing a pure white wedding dress and walking hand in hand down the aisle with him. But now, seeing this bracelet again, all I felt was regret. What I had once longed for but could not have, I now possessed, yet I no longer wanted it. I arranged to meet Jake at a cafe. When he sat down, I pushed the bag towards him, telling him that the gift was too extravagant and that I couldn't accept it. Jake's face showed surprise and then pain. "Does 5 years of love not outweigh my momentary distraction?" he asked. After a pause, he continued, "As long as you're willing to come back to me, we can get married right away. I'll hold a grand wedding for you so everyone can witness our happiness. I swear I'll love you forever, Emily. No one else." I listened quietly, feeling like I was hearing an impassioned speech from a stranger. The feeling was strange. If this had been the old me, I would have been overjoyed, happily linking arms with Jake and acting coy. But now I felt no emotional change. Seeing that I hadn't reacted, Jake sat beside me and pulled out photos from his phone. He excitedly showed me pictures of wedding dress designs. "I found your favorite designer, and she promised to make a unique dress just for you. You can look through these sketches and pick the one you like." To Jake, marriage was his biggest concession. I should be grateful and reconcile with him. After all, he was offering me what I had once desired the most. But with the crack in my heart, how could I pretend nothing had happened? I took a deep breath and looked at him, saying, "Jake, we'll never reconcile, no matter what." A flash of disappointment crossed Jake's face before he became agitated. "Is it because of Luke?" I shook my head. Jake, this has nothing to do with him. Our feelings have long since soured. Perhaps my love for you started to fade the moment you lied, or maybe when I saw Chloe frequently sharing details about you. What seemed like perfect love gradually became negative points. Jake's body trembled like leaves falling in autumn, and his eyes filled with painful regret. I was wrong. I was really wrong, Emily. I didn't respond and walked out of the cafe. At that moment, I just wanted to clear my mind, so I took an early shower and went to bed. I lay there until Luke knocked on my door. I was still lounging in bed when I heard his voice. I hadn't even combed my hair, so I went straight to the door. He stood there neatly dressed and looking smart. "Where are you going?" I asked, surprised. He raised an eyebrow. "Didn't you see my message?" It was then I remembered I had forgotten to charge my phone the night before. I groggily shook my head. Luke leaned in and kissed my cheek. "I'm going on a business trip. Wait for me to come back." I nodded, and he gently picked me up again. "You've been so tired lately. Sleep a little longer." Then he kissed my forehead and helped me close the door. After sleeping for half the day, I finally got up and checked my phone. Luke had sent a lot of messages. The first one, from the early morning, said, "I miss you. I can't sleep." About 10 minutes later, he sent another, "I know you're asleep, but I still wanted to message you, afraid that when I wake up, it'll all be a dream." I found his messages both funny and touching. The last message, sent at 2 a.m., read, "I have a business trip tomorrow. My home password is 1015SN. If you have time, could you water the plants for me, my girlfriend? October 15th is my birthday, and Luke has been acting so foolish these days. Aside from him, he messages me during the day and video calls me at night, and I feel no distance between us. Today, Luke sent me a voice message saying he would be back tonight and asking me to wait for him. His return made me feel like I was floating on clouds, so I decided to surprise him with a lavish dinner at his place. I bought all the ingredients he likes, and using the password he gave me, I opened the door. To my surprise, I heard noises coming from inside. Had Luke returned early? Oh, as soon as I opened the door, a knife was suddenly pressed against my neck, and the door slammed shut behind me. I froze in place. The man in front of me wore a mask and asked about my relationship with Luke. I could only tell him, "I'm his neighbor. He's on a business trip and asked me to water the plants." The man looked at me suspiciously. Just then, my phone rang, but I didn't dare move. He coldly ordered me to answer the phone. I trembled as I picked it up, glancing at the caller ID. It was Jake. The man lifted his chin, gesturing for me to turn on the speaker. I did as instructed and pressed the answer button. Jake spoke first. "Honey, I've gone grocery shopping. By the way, the Wi-Fi is set up today. The password is 1.261091519. Make sure to write it down." I had once joked that if I were in danger, I would use this code to alert him. The 12261 represents Lage, and the 091519 corresponds to the letters S and O, the 19th and 15th letters of the alphabet. I wasn't sure if Jake remembered this. Jake quickly responded, "Okay, call me later. I'll come pick you up." After hanging up, the man found a rope and tied me to a chair before rummaging through the drawers. I was drenched in cold sweat, only worrying that Luke might call me at this moment. After a while, my phone rang again. The man glanced at me and slowly walked over, taking my phone. After seeing the caller ID, he pressed the answer button. Luke's voice came through the speaker. "Didn't I tell you to wait for me at home? Where are you hiding?" He only said those words before the man hung up the phone. With a cold sneer, he asked if I dared to play tricks on him. Then he slapped me hard. My face was turned to one side and my ear rang. Suddenly, I heard footsteps from outside. Seizing the chance, I gathered all my strength and leaned back. The stool lost its balance, and with a loud bang, it hit the door, causing me to fall to the ground. The sudden movement sent a sharp pain through my body. It hurt so much that I almost bit my own back teeth in pain. Furious, the man approached me with the knife. In that moment, the door behind me burst open. A figure rushed in. It was Jake. Just as the knife was about to strike me, he stood in front of me. The blade pierced directly into his back and blood spurted out, splattering across my face. I screamed, "Jake!" The police arrived quickly and subdued the man. The scene became chaotic. Later, I learned the man was Luke's rival, who had somehow discovered where Luke lived and came to take revenge. Someone came to help untie the ropes around me. I held Jake tightly, not wanting to let go. He smiled weakly in my arms and said, "Fortunately, you're okay." Eventually, both Jake and I were taken to the ambulance. By the time Luke arrived at the hospital, I had already been bandaged up and was sitting in the hallway while Jake was being taken into the emergency room. Luke wanted to hug me, but hesitated. When I leaned against his chest, tears fell down my cheeks. He trembled and said, "You almost got hurt." I comforted him. "Everything is fine now." Then he looked toward the emergency room again and asked if Jake was inside. I nodded. The surgery lasted for several hours. When the doctor came out, he shook his head and informed us that the wounds were too deep, and Jake had lost too much blood. Most importantly, his will to survive was very weak. After the doctor turned and left, Luke and I went to visit Jake in the ICU. There was a heart monitor by his bed, and he lay quietly, his face as pale as paper. I softly called his name. "Jake, wake up, can you hear me?" To my surprise, the heart monitor began to respond. Even the doctor was shocked and encouraged me to keep talking to Jake, even making wishes to him to stimulate his will to survive. I turned to look at Luke, and I saw that he was staring at me. In that instant, I understood what he meant. So I leaned closer to Jake and whispered, "When you wake up, let's start over, okay?" At that moment, the heart monitor's fluctuations increased, and the doctor and nurse quickly asked Luke and me to step outside. A new round of resuscitation began. Walking out into the hospital corridor, I tightly held Luke's hand, hoping Jake would wake up. The emotions in Luke's eyes were complex and difficult to decipher. I understood his feelings. The next day, the doctor informed me that the surgery was successful and that Jake had regained consciousness. When I received the news, it felt as if the whole world brightened. However, when I looked at Luke, I felt a wave of confusion. The atmosphere was heavy, and as we headed to the hospital, the doctor mentioned that although Jake had woken up, his consciousness was still unclear. Hearing Jake call my name in his sleep, Luke excused himself to handle some matters. I also made an excuse to leave and handle some things, leaving me alone in the hospital room. It felt as if there was an invisible barrier between us. We could no longer be as intimately close as we once were. By the afternoon, Jake was fully awake. When he saw me sitting by his bed, his expression softened. He asked, "Emily?" I softly replied, "Yes?" Then he glanced behind me as if searching for someone. I realized he might be asking about Luke, so I told him, "Luke had to leave for something." Jake stared at me for a long time before suddenly laughing. "When I was unconscious, I heard you calling me. You said that when I woke up, we'd start over." My heart tightened at that instant, and I didn't know how to respond. But Jake's smile made me realize that those promises from the dream no longer mattered. Now that he was awake, the dreams were just that, dreams.